We're going to talk today about writing and family, and I was very specific in calling it balancing risk and reward because people talk about the risk a lot and worry about the risk a lot, but I think there's strong reasons why we need to write about family and loved ones, and there's also rewards to writing about families and loved ones and exploring those parts of our lives as writers. So there's four of us, and we're going to give our own take on how it's played out in our own work, and we've got really compared notes too closely, so we may or may not entirely agree. It'll be more interesting if we don't. And I structured it so that I hope there's plenty of time at the end for question and answer and discussion and exploration, because it's not the sort of subject where there's one answer. You know. Should you write about your family? Yes. Should you write about your family? No. It's more complex, and that's true of all things that are worthwhile. So this is one of them. I've been teaching memoir for more than 20 years now, and probably the most commonly heard phrase that's come up to me as people approach me after class, in class, at summer workshops, or after I do a reading is, I want to write about my family, but. And that what comes after the but is is what I hope this afternoon is going to be focused on. I've written some stuff down, and then I'm going to wing some stuff, and then we're going to go in roughly alphabetical order, and then we'll get to Q&A. But I'll start with a story. My mother, who's passed away about 10 years ago, struggled with addiction and depression all of her life. And in her 60s, she had a serious alcoholic relapse, one that ended her in police custody. She was 68. She had a DUI at 10 in the morning, resulting in a car accident. She T-boned another car of a man who turned out to be the 90-year-old father of a local judge. It did not end well, not her best moment. I wrote about that story, not so much about the car accident, but about the relapse and the alcoholism. About 6 months after it occurred, it took me a while to write the story, and I covered the events of my sister discovering the extent of my mother's drinking, my sister and I going to my mother's home and determining how and where she had hid the alcohol from us, the phone calls that went back and forth between my sister and I, the conversations I had with my mother, some early attempts at intervention. I covered those all in the story. I pulled actual phone conversations out of memory and inserted those phone conversations in early drafts. Other details about my mother's hidden habit, including some of the dialogue between the two of us, were also inserted very, very closely to what had really happened. In other words, even though I identified as a fiction writer back then, my MFA is in fiction, this story was thinly veiled autobiography. I changed my own name to James. I gave my sister a new name, Loretta, and moved everything 100 or so miles south of the western Pennsylvania town where I was raised to another similar small industrial town. As it turns out, the sister in question, I actually have two sisters, but for the sake of fiction, I reduced it to one. This sister read my story after it was published and said she was touched. The odd thing is that what moved her the most was a particularly unflattering detail, a detail I had lifted from her own life and given to her doppelganger character. The character, Loretta, slept with married men repeatedly, and James, the character who was more or less me, speculates in the story more than once as to why she does this. I didn't realize you understood me so well, my sister said to me after she read that. I'm touched. So that was good. But then my sister, Susan is her name in real life, decided to show this story to our mother. I never quite understood why or what she intended, and I wasn't there when my mother read the words I had written. But Susan phoned me later that day with a full report. You know that story of yours, she said. I showed it to Mom. In my memory, I think I just sat in silence on my end of the phone. Don't you want to know what she said? Jesus, Susan. Mom sat there and read the whole story, page by page, my sister told me. And she didn't utter a word. And then when she was done, she put the magazine down on the table, looked up to me, and said, "Oh, that Dinty. How does he think this stuff up?" She said, "What? How does he think this stuff up?" That was my mother's final and only word on the story. I never confronted her, of course, to find out if she recognized herself in the story. I cannot imagine that she didn't. She had a tough life, and I think she survived by putting things aside that she didn't want to deal with. I want to take a minute and reflect on why we write about family, because we do. Family forms us. You know, we come out of family, even family absences, people in our lives who should be that aren't there for whatever reason. And that's really the shaping mechanism of the clay that we are. Family, for the most part, remains connected to us throughout our lives. So why wouldn't we write about family? Why wouldn't that be the story we most want to tell? And family is never simple. You know, the things we want to write about are the things that are unanswerable. Those are the best questions to ask in a piece of literature or any work of art. And the questions that come up in family, why did so-and-so do this? Why didn't so-and-so not do this? Why is so-and-so that way? Why, in my instance, my family story, why did two well-intentioned people end up married to each other and screw it up so horribly? And how do the children survive? You know, those are the questions that families raise, and those are the questions that are never answered. And because we as writers are shaped by those questions, that's what we're going to write about. And I'm fully an advocate of just go ahead and write about it. Even people who don't write, people who just tell stories over coffee or beer, friends, real people, not writers. What do they talk about most? Family. Sometimes, you know, if you're in college, you talk about college roommates who become family. If you are talking to coworkers, you're talking about the family in the office. A lot of the same complications and problems arise, but it's family that these stories come out of. I want to offer two quotes. One is by Anne Lamott. You may have heard it. It's very often thrown out there. You own everything that happened to you. Tell your stories. If people wanted you to write warmly about them, they should have behaved better. I half agree with that. Maybe during Q&A, or maybe my colleagues here will get into some of the places where you might want to draw a line and not write. But I pretty much agree with if people wanted you to write warmly about them, they should have behaved better. I also pretty much agree that there are stories to tell. I mean, if they are our stories, not our neighbor. Susan Cheever has another quote that I'm overtly fond of. I think the purpose of the memoir, the same as the purpose of the novel or any other writing, is to enlighten. It is to bring light to where there is darkness. I find that endlessly true. I find that endlessly empowering is kind of a goofy word, but it gets me started in the morning. The idea that I'm not just writing my stories out of ego, I'm not just writing my stories out of self-obsession, but I'm writing what I'm writing to try to shed a little bit of light on what is darkness. Those of you who write memoir or follow the memoir genre, every 5 years, somebody pops up in the magazine somewhere and says, "Oh, memoir, it's actually memoir," and these people are so self-obsessed, and memoir is not a real genre, and we shouldn't pay any attention to it, and it's not art. And why do these people keep whining about their own sad, deprived lives? And I say in response to that, not as articulately as I'd like to, because I'm winging it here, but so many books written about things where the darkness, where the light had not been shined, have changed the world in so many good ways. We didn't talk about race in America or acknowledge our racial past until novels, certain novels came out, and then James Baldwin started writing about it in memoir form, and writer after writer after writer realized it was safe and important to talk about it. Spousal abuse, family secrets like alcoholic parents, family secrets like depressed parents, substance abuse. When I grew up, probably a few people in the room remember this. Like, you didn't talk about it. That doesn't leave the house. That's a family secret. And sharing family secrets, I think, has done a lot less damage in the world. Maybe there's a memoir here or a memoir there that somebody shared a family secret and did a little bit of harm to somebody in their family, or the relationship was badly affected by having written about that. But the good that these memoirs do, both empowering other people to write their stories, or just for that, I'm flashing back to the 1960s now, that poor kid in Iowa who thought he was the only gay kid in America, or that person, that child in New York, upper New York State, who was getting who had been knocked around by her father. Maybe she was an adult now and thought, well, I'm the only one who ever got knocked around by my father. I must have deserved it. The fact that these stories are being told, that the light is being shined into places where there was previously only darkness. I think it's done a lot of good for the world, and I think the world moves forward in good ways because of it. Personally, I told you the story about my mother. Let me tell you about my father. His life and story was even tougher. He was a lifelong alcoholic, not the kind that drank at home, not the kind that nobody knew about. He was the town drunk, which was very embarrassing. He would, and this is literally true, he would come home late at night to our street where there were 2-story houses, 4 squares with a front porch, and pick the wrong house. And once or twice a month we'd get a phone call saying, your dad's here, you better come get him. I would go weeks without seeing my father. Amazingly, he held down a job throughout all of this as a Chevy mechanic, but he'd be gone before I woke up in the morning, and he'd be out drinking well past my bedtime at night. He himself was a victim of abuse from his own father. He was a lifelong stutterer, not a happy man. But I didn't know any of this really. Growing up, I knew there was something wrong with my family. I knew that we were embarrassed. I knew that people looked at us a little differently than other families on the block. I was the youngest in the family, the most vulnerable, or at least I felt that way. I was certainly the least capable of influencing my family and changing the situation, as happens with children. I'm sure a lot of us can tell this story. It turned into there's something wrong with me. I began my own lifelong struggle, self-doubt, depression. Now I've depressed everybody telling this. But the thing is, nobody ever talked about it. Nobody ever took me aside and said, here's what's happening with your father, or how do you feel about what's happening with your father, or, this is not your fault, or this happens to a lot of families. Turns out I learned it happens to a lot of families, but I didn't know that at the time. I think if someone had given me a book or a story back then that explored this sort of situation, it would have made a big difference in my life. Even if that person who had written the book had been told, don't tell that story, it's a family story, it should be a secret. Even if that family were negatively affected, it doesn't always happen. Often families don't object as much as people worry they do. But even if some family member had objected, or there had been some sort of a break in the family because someone told a family truth, said something unflattering about Aunt Harriet, whatever, I think it would have helped me to read that book. And then around age 40, I decided to write that book. And I started asking the questions, and I started exploring, why this happened, and I started not just saying this happened to me, oh, poor me, or this happened to me, there's something wrong with me. Now that those feelings don't go away. But I started asking questions about my father. Why did this happen? What was it? What was it in his upbringing that led him there? What happened to my mother? My mother's father was a suicide. Both of her parents were suicides. What happened to my mother that brought her here? How did you get these two people who were so utterly incapable and unwise in having children. How did they get together, fall in love, have children, and then, and all of this happened. And the experience of writing all of that, the experience of facing all of that, honestly, the experience of going to the places I didn't want to go, the experience of understanding my father so much better, understanding my mother so much better, still being pretty not okay with the choices they made, but awfully sympathetic to why they made those choices and how it was almost entirely out of their control at certain points in their life, has utterly changed my relationship to them. In some cases, in the case of my mother while she was still alive, in the case of my father after he had passed, but I have a relationship with my father different than I did because I wrote family secrets, and part of that is to explore the family secrets, which brings me to my two last points. The first one is you have to have compassion. Why are you writing about family members? Why are you writing family secrets? Why are you exploring this material that the voice in your head or your older sister or your Aunt Harriet are telling you don't ever write about that? You're exploring it to understand, not to get revenge, not to rebuke, not to point a finger, not to get sympathy for yourself. You're trying to understand, and to understand you have to have compassion. Very few people wake up in the morning and think, it's a pretty nice Tuesday. I think I'll act poorly today. Most people wake up in the morning and say, I'm gonna beat this. I'm gonna do a better job. I'm gonna be a better parent. I'm gonna be a better spouse. I'm gonna be a better person. And then life gets in the way. And on a writer, so you have to have compassion when you write about these things. And then on a craft level, on a writing level, if you are writing about family in nonfiction, fiction gives you a lot of latitude to do a lot of things. Not that it's easy, but if you're writing about family in nonfiction, you just have to write it the way it happened. You have to write everything. You have to put everything in, and then you can decide, I'm going to publish this. I'm not going to publish this. I'm going to publish this, but only after Aunt Harriet dies. I'm going to publish this in a magazine, literary magazine, because, think how many members of your family read literary magazines. There's a lot of choices you can make about publication of these stories. If you're writing them, you have to write them. If you start leaving things leaving things out, the reader's going to sense it immediately, and whatever conclusions you reach about the story are going to be false if you don't include the full picture. Thank you. Carol Ann is next, and then Eugenia, and then I believe Bill is bringing up the rear.
Well, thanks, Denty. I think that the urgency to write what happened that you just mentioned is really underneath all of it for me. There's a famous poem by Robert Lowell toward the end of his life. One of the facilitators of the confessional movement, he said, why not say what happened? Like, it sounds like such a silly question, but it actually turns out to be quite difficult to say what happened. And so a lot of what Dinty said resonates with me, that you write to solve a problem. You come from a point of understanding, wanting to understand. In my poetry, I'm supposed to talk more about poetry than prose, just because I think I was asked to, not because there aren't other people who could, to my colleagues who have done this also. But for me, my particular brand of poetry is always aiming for nonfiction anyway, so the distinction isn't quite as great as it would be. Poetry is in that nice, I guess, sweet spot where you can choose, I guess, to say that something is fictional. But I don't give myself actually that to do, because I'm trying to I'm hewing to the real because I am interested in doing that. So it was a natural transition to me, I think, to write nonfiction prose. So the distinction between the poetry I write and the prose I write has to do with what I think that the piece I'm writing needs from me to open up. More than writing a poem or writing an essay. It's really, what's the problem I'm looking at? And what are the elements of craft that seem to be able to hold that emotion long enough for me to look at it closely. So sometimes that's narrative, and sometimes that's lyric, sometimes that's a poem, and sometimes that's prose. I grew up with a natural dislike of story, probably because my family was really good at telling them. And I didn't like how they packaged things I had witnessed inside meanings I disagreed with. I just immediately had a dissonance between what I was perceiving was happening in my family and what was being packaged for what I call like an inherited knowledge that tends to happen. Families themselves, I think, are structures that naturally assault the individual consciousness. There's just kind of no way to be a sentient being with your own ideas about things and inside a family without feeling conflict. That's if your family is a loving family, as they like to say, or a broken home, as they like to say. The conflict is there inside the fact that you breathe the same air as people, and yet your perceptions differ. So I'm the last of 7. It's kind of funny. I had no control over what anyone did at any time. My superpower was being able to sit right there and watch the action from under the table. Whatever that action was, great things, terrible things, all of it, the whole sweep of humankind seemed to come through that 3-bedroom bungalow on the Atlantic Ocean. My brother, who's only 4 years older, is like, I had to leave it to Beaver childhood with a dull headache. So that gave me permission to explore the dull headache, because at least I had people. I did have reckoners who also seemed to be kind of calling the question on the narrative. I guess I had other lyric people around. But I had a mother who would say, I wish you hadn't said that. And a dad who would say, good question. So it was like, what? So really, the only answer was the urgency I felt to whatever I might write, like about what I was seeing. So I have held fast to the idea that my writing is the better to love the people in my life through knowing them better. I feel as if the unconditional love that I feel has in it room for criticism. But I also really work with craft to try and test I don't make a lot of assertions. So I know that there are some things I've cut out. Maybe I'm cutting them out. Maybe they're just a way of working. I work with questions and with what happened in a kind of a detail way. And that individuality and solitude that I think I've always wanted, that the family seems like it doesn't have room for sometimes. I don't know if other people feel that way, but sometimes I think the writing life is the carving out of a quiet place. So that solitude, I almost I go in there just so I can see them better. And that's to talk about writing about parents and siblings. And then, I'm keeping track of time. I also, publication's a nice little moment where occasionally you'll publish something and kind of not realize how bad it was, or not realize, you can't, as the book said, as what we read said, you can't predict what's going to upset them for sure, but sometimes you're like, whoa, that seemed harsh, and it's never the thing that you thought was harsh. But there was one paragraph in my new book that's coming out of essays. I remember when I got it accepted at Agni, which has a really nice online component. Then I got it accidentally simultaneously submitted it, which I don't do a lot, but to Image. And Image is mostly print. And so I knew the Agni people, so I wrote to them and I was like, I'm sorry, I can't publish this here. It's searchable online. And there's a paragraph in there that makes me uncomfortable about my mother beating us with a hairbrush. The paragraph had a title called Blows. And there wasn't a lot of this in the piece, but there was this paragraph, and I knew my sister was capable of showing it to my mother.
They will do that.
So Bill Pierce, the managing editor of Agni, luckily I had published in that journal, so they didn't hold it against me like this stupid rookie mistake I was making. Of like, actually with, you know, I was raised to dance with the one who brung you, and, you know, the Agni had taken it first. And here I was giving it to Image. Total bad form. And he was just like, that's fine, but you do realize that she could find Image. I was like, she really can't find Image. But then as it became a book, it's actually the last book of mine that she read before she died, this paragraph, I changed it. I changed it for her so she could read it. Like, and I kept blows, and I just said, you know, it was about my brother shielding me from blows. So he would stand in front of me and get hit instead. And I just changed it to my brother shielded me from the unaccountable. I took the hairbrush out, I put the unaccountable in. And then I realized the way you read it, you really couldn't tell who's doing it, the mother or the father. And then that made me think, well, he's responsible. My father is also responsible for my mother hitting me. Do you see what I'm saying? So there's a way in which that's true. And so I put it in there. She loved the book. She thought it was amazing. She never even picked up on Blow's paragraph. Actually, she said, now you're really writing, because I published a couple of poetry books, and now I had a nonfiction book, and she was like, prose. So she was like really excited about that. So then she died, and then the book got accepted, and so I was like, oh, I can put the hairbrush back in. And I was like, no, man, because like I like that this is implicating my father. And my siblings actually shielded me from more than those blows. So what I'm saying there is, I guess I'm taking you through like how it is that I test what I thought I knew. So even the tension or the worry about your parents can be part of the rigor of your craft practice, if you're willing to test it. And then I have just two other things. One is, it's a whole other ballgame when you're writing about your kids. Again, I did it kind of unaccountably. I didn't really like think it through, and they were part of my life, and then they became like all of my life for a while. It felt like starting to come out of that now that they're 11 and 15. They've got to have their own like space. So I published a whole book of poems about them. My first book is me pregnant with my son, grieving my father's death, so he's already there in that too. It's sort of like they're implicated throughout. So recently I asked my son Willem's going to be a junior in high school when this nonfiction book comes out that's entirely about raising him and his brother in Newtown. And I said, you know, do you want to read it before it comes out? Your friends might read it. Probably not, but, you know, like it might get around town. He's like, it's really painful for me to go back to that stuff, so I don't think so. He'd read some of it. I'm like, oh. And he's like, oh, I can't do that to you. It's boring. It's boring. And then my husband was in the room. I said, well, do you want to read it? Like, he's like, and my husband's like, am I sympathetic? He's like, I said, yes. He said, no. My son's like, yeah, am I sympathetic? I'm like, yes, you're sympathetic. So, I mean, what people care about, you think they're going to care, or the other part of it where they don't care at all, and you're like, I'm still not known or seen. None of that. Really, you can't be anybody but a writer at your desk. You can't be a writer and a wife, a writer and a husband, a writer and a son, writer and a daughter. You're just a writer, you're a reckoner. But your love for those people is actually bigger than their role in your life. Does that make sense? So like, that's what I found. You start to get this blessing of seeing them with their first names. Mm-hmm. You know, like that, you know, that guy went into the Navy and ended up putting a man on the moon or whatever. So that's a real blessing. I'll give it to you guys after, but about writing about family, Rilke is the one that I love. So I think I'll just end reading this quote. And it starts with solitude, which I think really is the problem, that there's not solitude in families. It's the root of it for me. Therefore, dear sir, love your solitude and try to sing out with the pain it causes you. For those who are near you are far away, you write, and this shows that the space around you is beginning to grow vast. And if what is near you is far away, then your vastness is already among the stars and is very great. Be happy about your growth, in which of course you can't take anyone with you. And be gentle with those who stay behind. Be confident and calm in front of them. And don't torment them with your doubts. Don't frighten them with your faith or joy, which they wouldn't be able to comprehend. Seek out some simple and true feeling of what you have in common with them, which doesn't necessarily have to alter when you and yourself change again and again. When you see them, love life in a form that is not your own, and be indulgent toward those who are growing old, who are afraid of the aloneness that you trust. Avoid providing material for the drama that is always stretched tight between parents and children. It uses up much of the children's strength and wastes the love of the elders, which acts and warms even if it doesn't comprehend. Don't ask for advice from them, and don't expect any understanding, but believe in a love that is being stored up for you like an inheritance. And have faith that in this love there is a strength and a blessing so large that you can travel as far as you wish without stepping outside of it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm the fiction representative. Everybody just write fiction. You'll be fine. So Sven Burkert's in The Art of Time and Memoir, his book, writes that the truth is in the specific psychic residue, not in the faithful mapping of episodes to external events. It seems to me that memoir, unlike reportage, serves the spirit of the past, not the letter. Indeed, no one who reads memoir believes, how could they, that exchanges happened exactly as set down, or that key events have not been inflected to achieve the necessary effect. The question is only how much departure is tolerable, and at what point does a modified recollection turn into fiction?
Mm.
So that was my question when I began to write The Calligrapher's Daughter. It started out as a memoir or a biography, I wasn't sure, a story about my mother's life growing up in Japanese-occupied Korea. It began because as I was writing a memoir about my relationship with my mother, I realized that the key component in my relationship was absence. And so how do you write that? It's just very difficult to write about an absent mother. And then the second thing was that her stories, even though we didn't have a great relationship, I loved her stories. And so, and I thought they were so exciting, they would sell better than my story. So, but I was more involved in her stories than I was in our relationship. And so I thought, well, let me investigate these instead. And so I began to write it as a biography of my mother and her life. But what I discovered was that I'm Korean American, but I don't speak Korean. And but at that time I had never been to Korea. I was born here in New York. So I had no access to Korea. I only had access through research. So the research I did just tons of research because I was afraid of being called out. But as I began to write these stories down and learned more and more about the period, it became more evident to me that I could not write them as biography, not only because I didn't have access to my mother. I didn't have access to the language. And any of the history was going to be merely research, not really lived. I had the cultural sounds in my head from being raised in a Korean household, but I didn't have I had very little else. And so how do I portray this nation and this upbringing, and how do I put her stories in context without creating her whole life around it? So, and since I knew very little about her whole life except for these stories and the history that I was learning, that was my point of departure. It's like, in order to make her stories come alive and to be in true historical context, I had to create I had to create a fiction in order to convey the emotional truth that I was trying to reach for. So once I made the decision that it was fiction, the world opened up to me in a way that I found very surprising. First of all, I was involved more in story. Like, what is the dramatic purpose of this chapter? It's not just the story she told me, but what does it mean in the larger sense of, human relationships? And so that was interesting. So I wasn't just involved with my mother. It opened up the story to a wider purpose. And then the freedom, as a result of that, to create other stories in order to augment that meaning was liberating as well. And then the limitation that I experienced was in honoring the reality of her stories. She was imprisoned. She was separated from my father for 9 years. So there was real hardship and real drama in her life. And I wanted to honor that and not belittle it. So not only did I know I had to write really well in order for that to happen, but that I wanted to honor her story. So that was the thing, that I didn't want to just capitalize on it. I really wanted to honor it. So that realization was very helpful to me too. And then I asked my mother how she felt if I were to write her story. She died in 2003, and I was still writing at that point. And she looked at me and she says, well, it would come to nothing anyway. So I was like, okay, Mom, that's exactly why I'm writing it as fiction, because it's not going to work for us to talk about it. So I would interview her and ask her things like, where would you go in 1938, when China was giving more pressure to Japan? Where would you go to have a day out, for instance? If with a girlfriend, where would you go? So she would tell me things like that, but she would consider them insignificant. But for me, they were the basis of a whole scene. So I would do research about the place that she said, and then would create a scene. In The Kinship of Secrets, I already knew that this was going to be a fiction based on family stories. And so I started out so it was easier not to write, because nothing is easy to write, but it was easier to conceptualize as a novel, because I already knew that I could do that, having done that before. And so there was no point of departure in that. It was already going to be fiction. And the freedoms were the same, creating scenes to augment the story as it was. But the funny thing is, in The Kinship of Secrets, there's less true fiction than there is in The Calligrapher's Daughter. So even though I was more free to create it, there was less. So there are a couple of precedents to writing the nonfiction novel, which is a term that's coined by Truman Capote for In Cold Blood. Mm. So, and then Sigrid Nunez, she talked about the autofiction, which was interesting. I'd never heard that term before. And Jeanette Walls, who wrote Half-Broke Horses in 2010, called her book about her grandmother a true life novel. So even though it was third person, it was close third, and it was more like a novel, but it was true to her grandmother's life. So I don't call I call novels pure fiction is how they're marketed, but the publisher is always careful to say these are inspired by true events. Mm-hmm. And what I find, especially in book clubs, is the fascination with the true events part. That connection is the most fascinating. So writing about family is valid. You know, it has great appeal. It's just the method of how you want to do it. And I say, go fiction.
Set?
Yeah.
So I've talked about nonfiction, Caroline about poetry, Eugenie about fiction. Bill's gonna dance.
Yeah.
You don't want to see that. Believe me, you don't want to see that. So I wrote this book because I didn't know how to write this book. At the time, which is about 20 years ago, Saving Troy was my first nonfiction book, and now, 5 nonfiction books later, I don't know why it was such a big deal for me, but it definitely was. I agonized my way through that book. And in the midst of that dilemma, after I'd written a feature-length screenplay called Fireground and a play for the BBC titled Rescue in 1996 and 1997, I was just trying anything in the bag of tricks I had at the time to inspire myself. I took off 1 year exactly, formed a writing group with a couple of my friends, and I wrote this memoir in poetry, I think to prove to myself that I could still write. I guess that was why I did it. But it seems like that was only partially successful because it took me 5 more years to get this book written, so not much inspiration there, I guess. I wrote the introduction for this panel about 2 weeks ago. It was full of all sorts of witty lines and useful exposition and pop psychology about family dynamics. Great stuff. Then when I got up this morning, I thought maybe I should reread my book. I hadn't read it in a long time. I was surprised to find that I still liked it. No, I mean, I seldom read any of my earlier books unless I'm doing a public reading from one of them. I was shocked that I still found a lot that I admired in the book. But then I started looking through some reviews and other papers I'd unearthed to get myself ready for the panel, to help myself try and remember who I was 20 years ago, and I found this letter that I'd written to my father right after the book was published. I didn't even remember I had written it. I hadn't read it again until this morning. My father died 10 years ago in 2008, and that fact made the experience of reading that letter even a little stranger. So I decided the letter would serve as a better introduction than the witty one I'd put together before. And much of it needs no explanation, but as you'll see, there are a few things you should know before you hear it. Title of the book is We Didn't Come Here for This. It's part of the last line from one of these poems. It's a shortened version of something my father shouted at me in Florida when I was 4 years old, right after he had saved me from drowning in the hotel swimming pool. The book is a memoir in poetry. Up to that time, I hadn't seen any memoirs written that way, so I thought I'd give that a shot. There are 17 poems in it, each one accompanied by a family photograph. All the poems are dramatic monologues in the voices of the 3 characters in the book, me, my father, my mother. There's also an omniscient narrator who chimes in here and there. Some of the poems contain 2 or more voices. I really intended it to be a play for voices, and we actually mounted a couple of staged readings, one of which my mother attended, with great trepidation, I can tell you. There are recurring poetic forms that I invented for the book, but also some traditional forms. There's a syllabic poem, there's a double sestina, a tanka, which is a Japanese form comprised of a series of related haiku, some other familiar forms. Now, Evelyn is mentioned early on in the letter. Evelyn is the woman for whom my father left my mother in sort of the mid-70s, and with whom he lived until he died. She blamed the book for a number of things, including the loss of a box at Saratoga. Now, the racecourse in Saratoga is the oldest thoroughbred racetrack in the country, and these boxes are very prestigious, the boxes in the clubhouse, and they're coveted by people who go there. The New York Racing Association uses them to reward celebrities, wealthy owners, trainers. My grandfather, and then my father, and finally my mother, by default had a box there, right on the finish line, from the late 1920s until the end of the century, and it really meant a great deal to all of these folks. My editor at BOA Editions at the time was Steve Huff. He told me that the publisher's lawyer had demanded that both of my parents sign off on the book before BOA would publish it. The board of directors of the publishing company didn't want either or both of my parents to sue BOA once they learned what I had revealed about them in the book. So I sent my parents galleys several months before the pub date and asked them to read the book, sign the forms if they approved. My mother signed the form, said to me, "Tell me when it's coming out, because I'm leaving town." And she was serious. My father didn't respond to the request, no great surprise. After a couple of months, I called him and asked if he had read the book. He said, "No, I haven't read your book. I don't intend to read your book." I said, "Okay, but there are some things in there you might want to know before it comes out." He didn't have to sign the form necessarily, but I wanted him to be aware that there were some really dicey stories he had told me that I used in the book. And his answer was, "You want the fucking form signed? I'll sign it, but I'm not reading your goddamn book." So the following week he signed it and he sent it back. Finally, a childhood pal of mine, Sammy Bizarro, there's a great name for you, it's mentioned in passing in this letter, and guess what? A friend sent me his obituary as I was driving down here last week. So on that cheery note, I'm here every Wednesday, folks. Try the chicken parm, don't forget, tip your waiter. Here's the letter.
Dramatic reading.
May 12th, 1999. Dear Dad, I am writing to respond to your recent letter and to talk about the phone call that Mom got the other night. First of all, I realize that nothing I say in this letter is going to change the way you think unless Evelyn agrees with it. You are deeply connected to her and seem to have given up your ability or your desire to respond independently. That's your business, and I'm not making a judgment about it. If you want to think about our relationship or about the book, keep reading. If you don't, forget about it and throw this letter away right now. Secondly, I want to make 2 points before I get into a discussion of my book. Walter Mooney, Ruth Harrison, and you, Jim Patrick, have all been notified that you no longer have clubhouse boxes at Saratoga Racetrack. When Mom contacted Joe Bruno and Senator Stafford to see if either of them could help to get the box back, they both said they had received several calls from others who had also lost their boxes. Do you really think that all of these people have sons who wrote books that included them? Do you really think there's any reasonable justification for Evelyn's angry accusations on the phone the other night? That I was actually responsible for the loss of that box? And why, after all, did you put your present wife, the one for whom you left your former wife, on the phone with your ex-wife to make the accusation and to shout obscenities about my book? Does it occur to either of you that people have feelings? Now, speaking of feelings, I want to talk about my book and the anger that you and Evelyn are obviously feeling and expressing. There are plenty of emotional options for you in response to this book. You could be furious, which you seem to be. You could be moved to read the book for openers and make up your own mind about how you were portrayed in the book, rather than taking someone else's word for it. You could be curious as to why I would spend so much time and effort on a book which has only a very small chance of making me any money at all. As a matter of fact, I usually only receive a $500 advance from my publisher for any of my books, and I waived this advance so that they could pay a better-known writer the money to write an introduction for the book. None of my books published by BOA Editions has ever paid me any royalties, and I don't expect this one to do that. So obviously I am not doing it for the money. I make that much in a day of teaching 5th graders. Why am I doing it? Because it's my life too. And I want to make some sort of emotional and artistic sense out of it, which I do by writing. If I was a painter, composer, sculptor, I would do it differently, but I'm a writer, so I write about it. In this case, I chose to include you and Mom and myself as the main characters in this memoir. And if you look at the epigraph that precedes the first picture and poem in the book, you'll see that it says a memoir is how one remembers one's own life. In other words, the book is a mixture of memory and imagination. Readers understand that the minute they read the introduction and then read the title of the first poem. How can I write a completely realistic poem about two people in 1946 when I wasn't even born yet? So the understanding from the outset here is that this book is obviously a recreation, a mixture of imagination with some verifiable memories. It's a kind of hybrid non-fiction fiction, because I can't possibly understand all the things that these characters are feeling or thinking if I am not alive or too young to understand them, or not present when certain things occurred, or not inside their minds. That's why the book is not called an autobiography. Readers understand that a memoir cannot, because of its nature, be completely comprised of absolute verifiable facts about its characters. These characters are imaginative recreations of people, not the real people, any more than actors playing roles in a movie about real people are those real people. And readers who have any discrimination or common sense realize that immediately. But the book is based to a great extent on events that did occur and on conversations that I take with you and Mom and Anna Bumstead. Many of the things I let the characters say in this book were said to me in different ways by you and Mom. Apparently, when Evelyn reads some of these words or contemplates some of the actions ascribed to your character in the book, she feels you should be ashamed of them. Clearly, she feels I should be ashamed to write a book about these things and publish it. That much is clear from her rantings the other evening on the phone about what a filthy and disgusting book it is. Well, I strongly disagree. And I am also surprised that all of a sudden there is all this interest in what I write. You never told me you read any of my other books. And I don't remember you expressing a whole lot of interest in or curiosity about my work as a writer in the past. As a matter of fact, when my publisher sent you the book in manuscript form many months ago, with the form which you signed that gave your permission to publish the book, you told me that you didn't even read it before you signed the permission letter. But now, interestingly enough, everyone is interested in my writing. Well, frankly, you should be interested, because this is one hell of a good book. To reduce it to the level of pornographic smut, as Evelyn has, is profoundly insulting to me, and I don't accept it. You can both think what you like of the book, but I am not about to apologize for it. It's more than a good book. It's a terrific book, and I'm proud that I wrote it. It's a book that was able to take the lives of 3 ordinary people, each of whom was simply struggling to survive and get along with each other, and show some courage and grace in the face of difficult circumstances and true grief, and give them not just life, but breath. These are 3-dimensional characters, and that's why they seem to create a response in readers. These people are alive in this book, sharing with readers a range of emotions, fears, dreams, and struggles that not many characters share. There are unpleasant things revealed about all 3 of them. It isn't just Jim's character in the book who is exposed. Billy and Betty are characters who show a lot of unpleasant emotions and reveal difficult experiences as well. Betty says in a letter that she's a terrible mother, and in another asks the Blessed Virgin to send an angel down to perform a spontaneous abortion because she's so guilt-ridden about her behavior and uncertain about her life. Billy talks about having sex as a 12-year-old and telling about it in confession, and about sneaking it to a strip tent. None of these characters is Lily White in polite, suburban, born-again Christian terms. But they're all alive and kicking and willing to share with readers their struggles and how they feel about them. And they all have justifications for their actions which are amply demonstrated to the reader. Jim's relationship with his abusive father more than sets the stage for his behavior. And we learn enough about him that we are surprised when he does not repeat his father's abusive behavior with his own sons. Read the book. Read the 1959 poem where the character of Jim is skating on Lake George and talking to his dead father, asking him why he never loved him. And tell me this is a filthy book. Read the poem about 1961, where Billy is telling Sammy Bizarro what a war hero his father was, and tell me this is a filthy book. Read the last page where Billy is talking about all the things he enjoys doing with his family that Jane Mansfield would never understand, and then tell me this is a filthy book. Sexual indiscretions or difficult emotions or human pain revealed do not make a book filthy for me. Censorship of literature that is trying to show us all how we think and feel in challenging lives and who we really are as human beings, and censorship of a book that gives dignity to its characters, that kind of censorship is what's filthy to me. I was in no way trying to hurt your feelings or to offend you with this book. If your feelings are truly hurt, I'm sorry for that. My intention was to find and make art out of my life, to understand my past and some of the characters in it, and to ennoble myself and Mom and my grandparents and you in the process. If I'm really sorry about anything, it's that you have not read my books all these years, and that you can't see what I'm trying to do with my life, and that we have not had the wonderful relationship that we could have had. I'm sure it wasn't easy having a headstrong kid like me to raise, and I take full responsibility for my part in making our relationship difficult. I am not sorry, though, that I was myself and I had my own path to follow, but I am really sorry that you couldn't love me and express it and show it, and I still love you.
Good reading.
You're going to go on, or should I ask the question? Did your father ever respond? Do you know if he read the letter?
He read the letter, he never responded. He told me many years later that he read it, yeah.
But never said anything about
He
it?
was a tough nut,
Yeah, no kidding.
yeah.
Well, you stayed in touch with him though.
We were estranged for about 7 or 8 years. Yeah. Maybe 2006 we kind of got back together a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, he was a tough nut.
Families are wonderful. I want to point that out.
I think, I just want to say that that it ends on love is the thing. I still love you. I mean, all these things we're writing. And somebody said that Mom, I said, crying out for your mother is like the original sort of like human, like every sentence is really, Mom, I cried, that's so big that you could feel all that and say, I still love you. That's what it's about.
Yeah, I'm sure he'd have his version of the story.
No, I meant your letter.
Yeah, no, I
You
know.
go through all of those things
Yeah,
and
yeah.
still say,
Well, I did love him, but I was pretty pissed off.
yeah, but
Yeah.
there's room for that.
Yeah. Absolutely.
That's the thing to remember, that love is bigger than any anger that you have.
So, was it how, I see that it was really important for your father to read your work, and that makes sense, but why?
You mean important to me?
Yeah, it was important.
Yeah, I would have liked it, sure.
Yeah, like, I don't know if I would want my family to read my work, like, if it was that personal, so like, why was it important to you, like, specifically?
Well, for a lot of reasons, but particularly in this book, I thought that I had made him into an interesting character, and he was an interesting character. He was very complex, very different than I am, but very complex, and I thought people should know the variety of experience this guy had had. And since this book covers 17 years, it begins in 46 with an engagement picture of him and my mother, and it's about the two of them. There are two voices on the page. And he's telling stories about the war. His unit, he was Darby's Ranger 2nd Battalion, which, as I was saying to somebody today, was in Saving Private Ryan. That was that battalion. And he had told me that story when I was 5 years old. And so when I saw the movie, it's like, oh, where's Dad? That's his unit, right? So, he had a really interesting life, and he was a horribly faithless husband. I mean, he just had so many affairs. He was just cheating constantly. I would catch him all the time, and it was just crazy. And I thought, well, that's, interesting. And he would brag about all this stuff to me. And I did lots of interviews with him, and he told me all these stories. I thought, well, it kind of ennobles this guy in a certainly odd way. And I wanted him to see what I do with his life. His new wife didn't want to hear that.
Did you think he'd appreciate that you were memorializing him in some way, like that you were like, you were telling his story for him? Like, did you?
If he had not been with that woman, yes. But I think he was secretly proud when he finally did get a chance to understand what was there. Because a lot of people are he was living in Florida at the time, and a lot of people in his hometown read it and called him and said, Jesus, Jim, it's bad stuff. I think Evelyn made him feel ashamed about what he had done, but he was secretly proud of all that stuff, I think. So, had his circumstance been different, maybe he would have been a different person. Yeah. The most interesting thing is he died in 2008, and I saw him the month before he died. I flew down to Florida, and I hadn't seen him in 11 or 12 years. And when I got to his house, my father was not a reader, ever. Got to his house, and I went to knock on the door, and I saw him sitting at a table reading a novel. I thought, geez, maybe I shouldn't knock. Maybe I should just go away. Maybe this is the last thing I want to see about this guy. Finally became a reader, Dad. Nice going.
I know a lot of you guys on the panel talked about your family's reactions when they read your work. Some obviously better than others, and some a little more comical. But how were you guys able to kind of prep yourselves for that? Because I feel like that's a big moment, considering our writing is so inherently personal, and you have no idea how they're going to react to it.
Well, I'll talk about some of the nonfiction pieces that I published, especially about my son. When I knew it was going to get published, I warned my ex-husband, his father, about it and asked him to read it so that he wouldn't be surprised. Okay. And so, and he was incredibly moved, and he loved it, and, allotted that it was going to get published, that the story was going to be out there. So I also think that between the process of your finishing your work and then it finally getting published, there's like a finally in there. So there's a long period of time where you learn to live with your work and own it in a way that allows you to then send it out for publication. And that ownership is part of, you're letting it go.
I'm in that process right now with not family, but mothers of people who lost children in Sandy Hook. There's a whole series of people I want to know about my book before it comes out, that are not family. But I think the extension to all humanity, the idea that what you're doing is trying to treat everyone with some kind of grace, and sometimes it's not a matter of actually wanting them to read it so much, just wanting them to know that you wrote it and that it's your story. I mean, one of the moms told me that there's another friend who's written a little bit that she's kind of upset with that person about what she's written, and she's not upset with me. And another friend of ours was like, why are you upset with her and not Carol Ann? And she's like, because Carol Ann's talking about her kids, and she needs to talk about her kids. So I think it's also about like wanting whoever it is to see that what you meant to do was something good. That's what I hear when I hear Bill's letter. I hear him saying, I tried to do this, I was doing this. If you just looked, you could see. That was that Francine is who said that at Wheeler, and her seeing that was just so gratifying for me, that she's like, of course she grants me my story. But family is who almost doesn't want to grant you your story. I mean, there's just something in them that doesn't want you to have your story. Hollis.
Do you want to handle that question?
Just really quickly, you have to believe in the book, and I think the story, and believing in it is part of what you heard in Bill's letter. This is important. Yeah. I wrote it. This matters. Yeah. In nonfiction, at least, I guess it's true in the other genres. Believing it is also being very careful to bullshit check yourself.
Yeah.
I mean, if the story or the book is coming out and you're still thinking, was I fair? Should I have said that? Then you're probably in trouble. Really have to sit with it and think, have I tried as hard as I can to remember this as best I can? Am I both looking at my older sister with compassion as well as being honest about her actions? And that's how I think you deal with it.
Let me just say something to that, Marina. It's funny, I was thinking about this couple weeks ago when I was doing the other introduction. I think I was at such a low point in my life as a writer at the time. I was so nervous because I couldn't figure out how to write this book that I went back to everything I knew. I mean, I knew poetry. I'd done a novel that was all dramatic monologues. I had published 2 books of poetry. I had written, by that time, I don't know, a couple of teleplays, 4 or 5 feature-length screenplays. So I sort of understood drama and voice. And so I went back and that's what I did, exactly what I knew, dramatic monologues, voice, and I got so wrapped up in the craft of doing it and in doing something original that I hadn't seen before that I kind of forgot, oh yeah, this is about people. Which sounds crazy, but I really did kind of forget. And also, even though I'd interviewed my mother right as I was researching the book, because my mother really did not tell me the stories my father did. And so I spent about 2 hours with her and went through a lot of family photographs and pulled the photographs out, put each one in front of her and said, talk about this. Tell me, what about this? She had lost a child. Well, the brother after me she lost. The next brother after that had cerebral palsy. The final brother, my father raped her about that one. So, and she hadn't revealed any of that. Nobody knew that about her. So she's talking about this, and I can remember while she's talking thinking, God, this is great material.
Oh.
It's like, who said, was it Flaubert who said, you got to take notes of the death of your grandmother or death of your mother, It's like, what was I thinking? I mean, obviously part of me is thinking, oh, that's terrible, what you've gone through. But the artist in me is thinking, this is great material. How can I shape that? How can I make this work right in my book? So I think there's a kind of myopia that attends composition sometimes. That once you do it, and then it's out there and you go, oh, geez, I forgot. This is real people. And real people are being written about by me. Yikes. Anyway, sorry, Emily.
No, that's fine. I was wondering if you can speak to the privilege of being a writer in this context. I think one of the essays in the book was talking about my story versus our story, and it was very real to me. This last semester I wrote something and my mom didn't want it to be published, and she complained that it was her story, not mine, but it had a deep impact on me, what happened. And I realized after that conversation with her, and I did push back and say it is also mine, like it is ours, and there's something to be said about it being a collective story. But I also realized that she didn't have the power to write it artistically and aesthetically in a way that other people would listen to it. So her perspective would never have the same platform as mine. And I'm wondering if you can speak to the ethics of that.
I have a sister who is also a poet, and so I just really hate how she writes about our family. I can't even read it. And it's just the fact that we're in the same field together. It's not meant as a joke. It's just to say okay, well, someone could feel that way about me. Do you know what I'm saying? But I do grant that that's her perception. But I feel like she's embellished it beyond recognition, and so I don't know about the ethics of it, but I think back to what Francine Wheeler said to me, you tell your story and you're on solid ground. Talk about my kid and I'm going to, I'm ready to fight you. So even within the family, there's a way to do that too, where you only tell your part. So you can tell about what you've received from your mother and how it affected you. And then in fiction can empathize, do that act of radical empathy that Eugenia is doing. I guess it depends on what question you're asking yourself and what you're really pursuing.
I do think your question is at the heart of the matter, though.
Yeah,
Very much so. And I don't know how to answer that ethics question, except by talking about intention. I think all of us have to say, what are we intending to do? What's my intention? Am I intending to get vengeance? Do I feel like I've been victimized by my family, and do I want to get back at them and embarrass them? Probably some people write for that reason. Other people, maybe to make sense of it. Other people, I guess I was trying to make art. I'm always trying to make art. But is that a smokescreen? I guess we could say that about anything, right? I was just trying to make art. Sorry I ruined your life, Shit, that was a mistake, So that's a tough question. What do you think?
Embedded in that is intention, and checking yourself again and again and again, and why am I doing this? And if you're doing it for the right reasons, to understand, to shine light where there's darkness, I think you have to go forward. You're an artist because you can't do anything else. The thing about your mother's part of the story and your part of the story, where I draw the line, and it's hypothetical, maybe not, I don't know. I read about my parents, their parents, and how that all funneled down to me, and to a certain extent I read about my sisters, not that much about them, just them in relation to me. Those are family stories. If I happen to know that my sister or my cousin had been sexually assaulted, but it wasn't part of my story, that's not my story to tell. There's that direct line of influence into my life, though, that it's me. I don't worry a lot about telling that story. But I have a line as to what somebody else, where somebody else's story begins. But
is that because of the content of those pieces, or is it because of the
it's
distance?
not my story. I wasn't involved.
Okay.
I guess it would be the other way around. If something wonderful had happened to my sister or cousin, but they didn't want to share it, that's not my story to tell either.
I would discuss it with the person, with your mom, I would discuss it with them and say, I'm having this ethical dilemma, because you're saying it's your story, but I think that this part is my story, and then see what the outcome there is there.
The other side of this, interestingly enough, is you think you know what the consequences are going to be. If you've said something revealing and somebody gets upset, you think, oh, well, I made a mistake. I shouldn't have done that. My mother, who I mentioned, said she was going to leave town because she'd be so embarrassed in front of her friends. When she went to the staged reading afterwards, all of her friends came, went up to her and said, God, Betty, I had no idea you were so brave. And she, totally transformed. And all of a sudden, the book was the best thing since sliced bread. Because she wasn't embarrassed.
But, is it our decision to release like that, Because I think, sorry, maybe I shouldn't go any further, but it's...
No, of course you should.
But just, in terms of my mom's case and, the family history of it all, it's she has chosen to hide something. And it feels hard for me to make the choice, even though her story has impacted me. And it has impacted the way I look at everything. So many pieces of my life, but I don't, she told me I can write it when she dies.
Well, that's the easy way out.
yeah, sometimes I say
know?
that. Wait, Baron.
I think there's a distinction, as far as your mom's concerned about this. Basically, unless you've lived your life utterly as a hermit, you don't have just your story.
Yeah.
What your mom has is her own consciousness.
Yes.
You're not taking away her consciousness. You're telling a story that every human being who has dealings with other human beings, it becomes part of their story. It has to.
What he said.
Yeah, I just wanted to turn it around, but it already started to turn around, to wonder about, for all of you, and Carol's brought it up, if you have other writers in your family, and when it becomes your children writing their life in which you're a character. Bill knows my son Tobias, who's a writer. He's published a couple of novels, a bunch of poetry. How will you react? How will you react to the artistry in which you are not in control, and in which someone else is using you as their subject.
Good question.
I wonder if you would be quite as cool about the artistry of it. And just one quick story, my son Tobias, when he was quite young, wrote a stage play, and he thought no one would ever see it because he wrote a play, and it won a prize. And so it was put on stage, and he immediately gave it to both me and his father to read. We're divorced by that point. And I read it, of course, because I'm a writer, and we had talked about it, and I was fine, and his dad didn't read it, he just showed up
To the real.
at the play. And I thought, oh my God, because it wasn't in no way cool. It was very funny, but it was really accurate. It was very much on point. And his father gritted his teeth and got through it, but it was a really awkward moment, to which we now often refer. But I just wonder, really, a reaction when you think about your own children turning it around, or your sisters, or your siblings.
Well, my sister, the other day she wrote a poem that referred to me in the title, quoting a line from Miklos Rednati, the Hungarian poet, at the end, as if I said it. So it's just beyond, annoying. And I was like, I said, I didn't write that. She said, I said you typed it out. I didn't say you wrote it. And I'm like, okay. But
it doesn't seem to me that you're giving her the same respect
Yeah.
the way you're giving yourself.
No. My point in bringing her up was to say, I see how the other half can feel. I am both parts.
Yeah.
And so, I'm just aware of that. As far as my own boys, I hope that I hope they're really good writers, but I know karma is what karma is, so it's coming for me.
I have a wonderful relationship with my writer son now, but when he moved to fiction, he's my best and first reader. He reads and actually gives me really good things. So I think as adults, a lot of that came about. It was the surprise factor. And now we joke when somebody does something awful in the family, and we just look at each other and
Who's
say,
taking it?
First person in print wins.
I know Toby.
He knows.
Toby's a good writer.
Toby's an excellent writer.
To answer your question, from my opinion, is if we're going to take that liberty for ourselves and say we have the right to write, then everyone else has that right.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I was saying
No,
that about my
neither
sister.
of my sons are writers, but if they did it, they did it, and I would hope they do a good job. But hey, they have the right to tell their story.
Yeah.
I also think there's another aspect to this that we haven't really discussed, but it builds on Alice's point, which is, I don't think it's only about intention, because I don't think we actually control everything that we write, and not just in terms of the impact that it has on other people, but you can't come back and say, I intended to do good, but you took it the wrong way, because as writers we have responsibility, and that includes responsibility for whatever the other person feels. And I'm not talking specifically to you, Bill, about, I've had this experience with people, including my sons, and, I have to own the fact that they aren't going to see things the way I see them, and that becomes an occasion for conversation.
Yes.
So where does that lead to then?
What it leads
How do
to,
we act as writers given that
I
notion?
take the risk.
Okay, that's fine.
I take the risk and I own the
But the piece is still the piece then, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, I will say that I did change a couple of things in one memoir that I wrote because of, I had to go back and think, if I put that in, it's a detail and it happened, but it's mean. I'm being mean.
But that's intention, right?
Yes,
That's self-understanding.
but it's because, but even still, what I told wasn't a very nice story because that was the truth of it. It's just that I didn't need to, dig the knife in.
Yeah,
and
but
twist and
that's
twist
you
it.
checking yourself
Yeah.
in a good way.
So I agree. It is what it is, and it has to stay what you write it as.
And self-censorship is the slippery slope.
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah,
think.
absolutely. Yeah.
I'm a very, very, very bad moderator. Does this one end at 3:30? Does this end at 3:30?
Yeah, you get 10
Okay.
or so minutes, but you're in charge of picking questioners.
All right.
The hand that's waving hard.
Whoever's waving a $5 bill.
This speaks to what Kathleen was saying, which is you talk about risk, you talk about intention. You talk about reward in the sense of was there a change in your head, your thinking about yourself, your understanding of family? Was it a sense of, you said your mother was transformed by watching your play. I mean, was that, kind of a transforming experience for you? I mean, why do this? I mean, yes, your reward could be publishing, but I'm thinking there's probably a hell of a lot more exactly that goes on, which might be driving the bus after all.
Yeah.
Well, I would like to just say, like, the reward for me is really in the very fact of whatever I learn at the desk, that I can immediately improve how I'm being in the world. So, like, mine is really almost yoga in terms of, like, especially the parenting stuff. It's like I take it there and I work on it, and then I hope I'm going to be better the next time something comes up.
Rewards for me have been, I just forgot what they are. Struggling to understand my parents, how my parents got where they are, how what happened to me happened, but there's not a lot of people to blame. Has made me a happier, healthier person. I still struggle, but I'm better off than I would have been if I hadn't spent the time trying to understand that with compassion. That book, Between Panic and Desire, which really goes into that, and a book I wrote was more of a spiritual autobiography about Buddhism. People contact me and say, that helped me to read that book. Not a lot, but every once in a while. That feels really nice. And makes me also, it feels nice, but probably more importantly, it makes me feel I'm doing the right thing.
I was a really rebellious kid and sort of constructed a victimized notion of the universe because my parents were so completely different than I was. And so I think what I learned in this book was I kind of changed that vision of myself because I felt I had to be fair to everybody. I had to ennoble all three of these characters. So partially, since it was my coming of age book, they were obviously adults, and that's a different story. But the coming of age book in each of the poems is written about me, were written kind of in a voice that I imagined for that age, which is really tough when you're 1 or 3 or, and I tried to age that character at least in terms of imagery and in terms of intellectual ability appropriately as the poems go on. So the 12-year-old knows a whole lot more than the 3-year-old, for instance, and the language and the style and the experiences reflect that. But I found out that how much I liked my parents in the process. And that was a good thing, because I hadn't liked them for a long time. And so that was a huge reward, that I ended up liking them. But then there are all the other artistic rewards that Carol Ann was referring to, and if you don't get them from every book, if you don't learn something from every single book, then I think you're probably kind of failing with it. What about you? Rewards?
So I used to regard my mother as the antagonist in, the story of my life. And one of the things that I did, which I always recommend in fiction, is to get into the mind of your antagonist and write the story from there. And so that's how the novel began, was because I enjoyed it so much, and I saw the value that I was gaining from it, having more compassion for her, understanding the journey of her life better, imagining it, making it real. So, yeah, definitely. So, I used to say we were terribly estranged, but after having written that novel about her life, I totally feel like I have a better understanding of her. She's been dead for a long time. And I regret that I didn't have this knowledge while she was still alive. It wouldn't have changed her, but it would have changed my behavior towards her.
Yeah, that's the good opportunity sometimes.
So that was definitely a big reward. And with the second book, it was the same. My sister and I just grew closer as a result. She's still alive, and we're very close now.
Well, thank you to my brilliant panelists.